Hello, Tom here from Dungeoneering, and today I'm talking about one of the rarest, hardest to find, and most expensive of the old TSR books. I'm talking about Warriors of Mars, the Warfare of Barsoom in miniature. A huge craft, long, low, and gray painted, swung slowly over the crest of the nearest hill. Following it came another, and another, and another, until 20 of them, swinging low above the ground, sailed slowly and majestically toward us. Each carried a strange banner, swung from stem to stern. Above the upper works and upon the prow of each was painted some odd device that gleamed in the sunlight and showed plainly even at the distance at which we were from the vessels. I could see figures crowding the forward decks and upper works of the aircraft. Whether they had discovered us or simply were looking at the deserted city, I could not say. But in any event, they received a rude reception, for suddenly and without warning, the green Martian warriors fired a terrific volley from the windows of the buildings facing the little valley across which the great ships were so peacefully advancing. This is from the 1914 Edgar Rice Burroughs seminal classic, A Princess of Mars, which launched the sword and planet genre and directly inspired Flash Gordon, Superman, Dune, Star Wars, and many characters and stories. This book is largely forgotten by the public to the point that the John Carter movie was actually accused of ripping off the very films this original book had inspired. The Mars novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs were a major influence on the early D&D game. Those original D&D books contained many references to barsoom novels than to any other fantasy literature, including Tolkien. Some of the races and creatures even appear in the wandering monster tables of original D&D. Gary Gygax acknowledges this influence in the foreword to Men in Magic, where he says, "These rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian adventures, where John Carter is groping through black pits, will not be likely to find Dungeons & Dragons to their taste." Even in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, references to Barsoom can be found throughout, including, most notably, in Appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide, which lists several, actually all of the Barsoom books for inspiration. The Warriors of Mars Rules for Miniature Wargames was published by TSR in July of 1974, which was just 6 months after the original D&D rules. This book was written and designed by Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom, and it's lavishly illustrated with 24 interior drawings by Greg Bell. Much more illustrations than you find in most of the TSR books from this period. This is a set of standalone rules for Adventures on Barsoom, and it's clearly not a role-playing game. There's just not enough there in any way to create or describe a character. Even though it does have some RPG-like elements, such as it has one-to-one combat and movement, there's some rudimentary character advancement rules with experience and levels, and also some suggestions how to make personal adventures. But it is clearly a war game, and it's much more closely related to chainmail than it is to Dungeons and Dragons. In the foreword, Gary Gygax states that this project was done at the request of the firm which originated the miniatures figures for this singular aspect of wargaming. According to John Peterson's book, Playing at the World, the firm is identified as Hinchliffe Models, which later became Heritage Models. The Edgar Rice Burroughs estate contacted TSR with a cease and desist, and so in order to avoid any legal action, this book was never reprinted. Which, it's kind of a shame because there isn't anything in here in Warriors of Mars that wasn't already out in the public domain. So that has made this book one of the rarest and hard to find books of all the TSR books. Copies do come up occasionally on eBay for hundreds of dollars. And if you really do some searching on the internet, I'm sure you can find a PDF copy of it. This book is divided roughly into 4 sections. There's the land warfare section, there's aerial warfare, there's personalities and creatures, and then there are tables in the back. And it also includes a map of Barsoom. The land warfare section provides rules for mass combat and sieges and individual combat. Individual melee involves rolling 3d6, and the results are compared to attacker versus defender on a rather dense table here in the back, which looks somewhat reminiscent to the fantasy combat table in Chainmail. So you would find the attacker, find the defender, and it will give you this little stat block, this little sort of target number block, and then you roll 3d6 for your result. You could either kill, hit, or trigger a special ability in combat. Missile fire is kind of a novel system. You roll 2 dice, and the first die roll is the target number that you have to match or beat in order to score a hit. And that number is modified by the attacker's status, weapon, range, and so on. The second die roll is the actual roll to hit that target number. Individual adventure guidelines describe, here's that section, describes unexpected encounters, basically wandering monsters, time and movement. And it has a rudimentary experience and advancement system. Let's see here. Here we go. Where basically characters can rise as high as 12th level, except John Carter is 13th level, of course. He's the ultimate badass in Barsoom. Fighting men and assassins are the only things that are mentioned that you could even remotely consider a sort of a class. And these experience tables, they include rewards for defeating your foes, for rescuing princesses, for capturing airships, capturing enemy warriors or items, freeing prisoners, and finding lost treasures. So in that way, it's kind of more role-playing game-ish than D&D was, which was all about killing monsters and taking their treasure to get experience. It does have some maps here of Barsoom, which are very loose interpretations. I don't think that they're particularly accurate from what I've seen comparing them to other maps of Barsoom, but they could be handy for having a campaign. So adventure locations, such as exploring deserted cities or delving into the black pits beneath, are given brief paragraph and a suggestion to consult the D&D rules. So with the movement rules and the individual combat and the experience and encounter charts, there's almost a proto RPG lurking in this book. But to turn it into an actual RPG would take even more effort, I think, than it would to take, say, Chainmail and turn it into an RPG. Aerial combat is probably given the most attention in terms of rules for movement and for flying, for fire, for elevation, suppression of guns, damage, ramming and collision, grappling, boarding, bombing. Yeah, it just goes on and on. Air and ground combat, firing at structures, ground to air, with tables for resolving these combat situations. This last section here, which I kind of skipped ahead to, very sparsely describes the characters and creatures of Barsoom before going into sort of the final table and charts. These characters include John Carter. Let's see, there's a picture of him. Includes John Carter, Tars Tarkus, Carthoris, Kantos Khan. It has a yellow warrior because it does have a section here on the Martian races, firstborn. It also describes creatures like white apes, Darsine, Malagor, with some, there's a white ape with some illustrations. And then for everything else, it just says other animals. The other Barsoomian animals are described in sufficient detail in the novels so as not to merit further attention here. There, an apt and Callot illustrations. Interesting, this Callot is very much like, looks very insect-like in its interpretation. I don't think I've seen very many Callots interpreted that way. They're usually more lizard-like in drawings. So Warriors of Mars, it's a standalone wargame, and it has more relation to Chainmail than it does to D&D. One good thing about it is the enthusiasm for Barsoom just shines through in the reading. It's very clear that Gygax and Bloom were very, really into this subject. And it's kind of a glimpse into what could have been if D&D had been this book instead of sort of the sword and sorcery mishmash of the books that were published were. So if you can find a copy, it's a great piece of gaming history. I'm not sure if it's worth hundreds of dollars, and that's all on how much you want it for your collection. But if you really want it, I think it is a really interesting book. I'd like to salute you for making it to the end of this video. I very much enjoyed making it, and it was fun delving through this classic book. If this genre is something that really interests you, I'd like to point your attention to my role-playing game, Warriors of the Red Planet, which explores the genre in a classic fantasy role-playing game style, lavishly illustrated, and very fun to play, and has gotten really great reviews. You can find the link below to my blog, and if you'd like to see more about this, at dungeoneering.net. All right. Happy dungeoneering. Later.